Oh, not nice. These people do bad things.
2 years before Ringo walked out of the White Album sessions, 3 years before both George left and John wanted a divorce from the group, it was actually Paul who was the first person to storm out of a Beatles recording session. It's the 21st of June 1966, and on the eve of their last ever world tour, the Beatles finally realise they are one song short for their next album, Revolver. With the clock ticking and deadlines looming for pressing and releasing the new album, John comes to the rescue and proposes 2 songs he's been working on for several months, joined together as one. The band meets up at 7 p.m. at Abbey Road to record John's She Said, She Said. Almost 9 hours later, in the early hours of the morning, and after 25 frantic rehearsal takes, the song is put to bed, but only John, George and Ringo remain in the studio. During this last-minute fraught session, believed to be after take 15, there was an argument, resulting in Paul storming out of the studio. We're given a small glimpse into this argument on the 2022 Super Deluxe edition of Revolver on take 15 of the basic rhythm track. At the beginning, Paul starts to criticise Ringo's timing, whilst John urges everyone to play on.
Well, far out there, Mrs. Starkey. I thought I came in one earlier and you were saying one more. Actually, I thought you were still having lunch. Keep going, keep going.
What exactly happens next is unknown. Despite all the many years, those present have kept quiet about what transpired. No recordings have been released of the argument, so we can only speculate as to the underlying causes. Firstly, Paul may have felt slighted, as John had worked originally with George on the song's composition. George explained, "I did actually do some writing with John later on. I was at his house one day, this is the mid-60s, and he was struggling with some tunes. He had loads of bits, maybe 3 songs that were unfinished, and I made suggestions and helped him to work them together, so they became one finished song, She Said, She Said." The middle part of that record is a different song.
She said, "You don't understand what I said."
Then it goes into the other one.
When I was a boy.
This was a real world, so I did things like that. Secondly, John liked to work fast. This is evident from his solo work, with most of his albums being recorded over a couple of weeks. She Said was the only song on Revolver recorded in a single take. In contrast, Paul preferred to take his time to perfect recordings, and his own contributions for Revolver were taking much longer than before. Both Eleanor Rigby and Here, There and Everywhere took more than 3 days each to record. Lastly, the She Said chorus was inspired while all 3 Beatles were on LSD, with the exception of Paul, who was subject to several taunts thereafter for holding back. As She Said has its psychedelic roots buried so deeply in LSD, it's possible that Paul felt further alienated by the lyrics and variable time signatures. As John recounts in his 1970 Rolling Stone interview,
we were on tour in one of those houses, like, Doris Day's house or whatever it was we used to stay. And the 3 of us took it, Ringo, George and I think maybe Neil, and a couple of the Birds, And Peter Fonda came, and that was another thing. And he kept on saying, "I know what it's like to be dead." And we said, "What?" And he kept saying it, we were saying, "For Christ's sake, shut up, we don't care. We don't want to know." But he kept going on about it. And that's how I wrote She Said, "I know what it's like to be dead." Well, it was a sad song, That was just an acidy song, I suppose. And when I was a little boy, you see. A lot of, early childhood was coming out anyway.
Paul remains tight-lipped on the incident to this day, liken it to a minor tiff. In Many Years From Now, which is the closest he's ever got to an autobiography, he wrote, I think we had a Barney or something. And I said, oh, F you. And they said, well, we'll all do it. And they did. In my opinion, I suspect that Paul got frustrated about not being involved in the arrangement. John favoured a more basic arrangement of guitars, bass and drums. Session notes list a piano track which never ended up on the final mix, possibly a suggestion of Paul's which John overruled. The argument was never publicly discussed at the time. However, it was deeply significant, illustrating the first break in the Beatles' otherwise relatively harmonious and productive working relationship together. Tellingly, after George quits during the Get Back sessions at Twickenham, John and Paul are captured having an in-depth discussion in a canteen. John brings up She Said, although this specific mention in the original Nagra tapes has been edited out by Peter Jackson, complaining about how his own Beatles songs were never recorded the way he would have liked. Michael Lindsay Hogg's hidden microphone picked up this candid conversation.
Now, the only regret about the past numbers is when, because I've been so bright, I've allowed you to take it somewhere where I didn't want. Yeah. And then that my only chance was to let George take over or interest George in it. Yeah. If you give me all suggestions, let me reject them and think the one I like. This is where we're writing songs. Same goes for the arrangement. I don't want it to. I don't know.
Yeah, I know, I do that. I know what you mean, yeah.
Because there was a period where none of us could actually say anything about your arrangements.
Yeah.
Because you would reject it all.
Yeah, sure.
And so George and I would just say, like you do about me.
Yeah,
I'm going about. And a lot of the times you're right. And a lot of the times you're the same as we always are.
The final mix used on Revolver was take 3, on which all 4 Beatles played. Thereafter, all overdubs used were courtesy of John, George and Ringo. George filled in for Paul on the vocal harmonies, and he also added a new guitar passage to the bridge. John played a single note on Hammond organ, faded up and down during the mix, with some additional bass notes, presumably played by George, as well as a shaker from Ringo. It's a superb track, and Paul probably regretted his minor involvement. The following day, all 4 Beatles met at Heathrow on their way to Munich for their ill-fated final world tour. It would be a further 5 months before they returned to record at Abbey Road again, starting work on John's epic Strawberry Fields Forever.